Something shifted the moment Sophie Cunningham and Lexi Hull spoke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming headline or public feud. But if you were paying attention, really paying attention, you could feel it. The tone was different. The confidence was different. And the timing? That wasn't accidental. Caitlin Clark is coming back. And when a player like Clark returns, it's never just about adding another name back into the lineup. It's about a complete power recalibration. Rotations tighten. Roles evolve. Careers either accelerate or quietly stall. But here's what most people are missing. While the league debates ratings, television deals, and collective bargaining drama, 2 Indiana Fever players have already made their decision. They aren't waiting to see what happens when Clark steps back on the floor. They've prepared for it. And the way they've prepared tells you everything about what's coming next. Sophie Cunningham didn't just rehab an injury. She rebuilt her body. Lexi Hull didn't just work on her jumper. She positioned herself at the center of a strategic shift. And when both of them publicly addressed Clark's return, the message wasn't emotional. It wasn't vague. It was calculated. They know what this season is about. Speed, adaptation, survival. Because here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. When Caitlin Clark is healthy, the Indiana Fever don't play normal basketball. They don't walk the ball up. They don't grind possessions down to 12 seconds. They don't wait for half-court sets to slowly unfold. They sprint. They stretch defenses to the breaking point. They turn every rebound into a track meet. And that style doesn't just test opponents. It exposes teammates. Some players thrive in chaos. Others get exposed by it. That's why what Cunningham and Hull revealed isn't just off-season fluff. It's a warning, a signal, maybe even a declaration. Because if Clark is returning leaner, faster, and more aggressive, then everyone around her has 2 choices: evolve or disappear. And when you look closely at what Sophie Cunningham just did to her body, you realize she has no intention of fading into the background. But the scale doesn't tell the full story. Not even close. The number shocked people at first. Nearly 16 pounds gone. For an average person, that's a fitness update. For a professional athlete already in elite shape, that's a transformation. And for a player coming off a serious knee injury, that's a strategic decision. Sophie Cunningham wasn't overweight. She wasn't out of shape. She wasn't struggling to keep up physically before. In fact, her identity in this league was built on strength, physicality, edge. She was the enforcer, the player who didn't hesitate to absorb contact, the one willing to step into chaos if things got heated. She had the build to set punishing screens, fight through traffic, and hold her ground when games turned ugly. That version of Cunningham worked in traditional systems. But the Clark era isn't traditional. And Cunningham understood something that a lot of veterans across the league are still wrestling with. Pace changes everything. When Clark pushes the ball, the possession doesn't begin at the top of the key. It begins the second the rebound hits her teammate's hands. That means wings can't hesitate. They can't jog into position. They can't take 2 steps to assess. They have to explode. Every single time. Now layer in the injury. Recovering from a knee issue while preparing to play in the fastest-paced offensive system in the league is brutal. Extra weight, even lean muscle, becomes extra stress. Every pound increases impact forces when stopping, cutting, accelerating. And Clark's game is built on violent changes of direction. Quick outlets. Sudden backdoor cuts. Instant transition threes. If Cunningham returned at her previous playing weight, she might survive. But surviving isn't the goal. Thriving is. So she made a choice that says more than any press conference ever could. She stripped her body down. Leaner frame. Less load on the knee. Greater endurance ceiling. Faster first step. This wasn't vanity. It was mathematics. Because here's what happens when Clark gets downhill with space. Defenders panic. Help rotations collapse. The weak side wing becomes invisible for half a second. That half second is everything. If Cunningham is a step slow, the opportunity dies. If she beats her defender down the floor, it's 2 points before the defense even sets. And there's another layer most fans ignore. Early last season, not everyone adjusted smoothly to Clark's tempo. Even talented players looked winded at times. It takes elite conditioning to maintain that rhythm for 4 quarters. Not just sprinting once or twice, sprinting repeatedly, possession after possession. Cunningham watched that unfold. She saw what happens when conditioning lags behind ambition. and she decided she wasn't going to experience that adjustment curve. She skipped it entirely. There's also a psychological message embedded in this transformation. When a veteran player alters their body this drastically, they're signaling commitment. They're telling the organization and the coaching staff, "I'm built for this system." That matters, because new coaching dynamics always bring uncertainty. Rotations shift. Preferences change. Veterans can get squeezed if they don't fit the vision. But a wing who can defend, shoot efficiently, and now run like a transition threat? That's not easy to bench. Especially when Clark's gravity creates open looks for players who know how to relocate and fire without hesitation. And make no mistake, Cunningham can shoot. When you combine improved mobility with high-percentage perimeter shooting, you're not just adding speed. You're multiplying offensive geometry. Defenders have to respect the corner. They have to respect the leakout. They have to respect the quick trigger. That stretches the floor wider than most teams can comfortably handle. But there's something even more revealing than the weight change itself. It's the timing. She didn't wait to see how Clark would look upon return. She prepared as if Clark is coming back faster than ever. That tells you how much belief exists internally. Because players don't sacrifice strength and restructure their bodies unless they trust the system they're entering. Cunningham isn't bracing for uncertainty. She's anticipating acceleration. And if she's right, if Clark returns leaner and more explosive, then this version of Cunningham becomes something entirely different from the enforcer archetype she built her career on. She becomes a transition assassin, a corner sniper who sprints the lane, spaces perfectly, and forces defenses into impossible choices. But transformation alone doesn't guarantee security. Because even if Cunningham is fully optimized for this new pace, the lineup decisions still hang in the balance. And that's where things get complicated. Because while one player rebuilt her body to survive the Clark tempo, another player may hold the key to whether that tempo even reaches its full potential. And what's happening behind the scenes with Lexi Hull could quietly determine everything. Most people are framing this as a return. That's the wrong word. Returns imply restoration. A player coming back to what was. Picking up where things left off. Settling back into rhythm. But nothing about Caitlin Clark operates in reverse. When she steps back on the floor, it won't feel like a continuation. It will feel like acceleration. Because here's what casual observers miss. Clark doesn't just play fast. She forces everyone else to play faster than they're comfortable with. Teammates, opponents, even coaches. And when that pace spikes, systems either evolve or fracture. Last season was the first real glimpse of what happens when Clark's style fully activates. The floor stretched wider. Defensive coverages bent in unnatural ways. Transition possessions multiplied. Games didn't slow down in the fourth quarter. They got more chaotic. But there were also visible growing pains. Not every lineup looked fluid in that environment. Not every veteran thrived in a system built on split-second reads and deep-range gravity. Some possessions stalled when the ball stuck. Some rotations looked hesitant. Some players looked like they were thinking instead of reacting. That's the difference between traditional half-court structure and Clark's ecosystem. Traditional systems reward patience. Clark's system rewards instinct. Traditional systems reward isolation scoring. Clark's system punishes hesitation. Traditional systems grind. Clark's system detonates. And that creates tension, even if it's never openly acknowledged. Because when a generational offensive engine dictates tempo, it subtly reshapes hierarchy. The ball finds certain players more often. Transition opportunities favor those who sprint first. Defensive focus shifts outward, which means wings and shooters can feast, but only if they're ready. Clark doesn't slow down to accommodate teammates. Teammates either rise to meet the speed, or they fade into reduced minutes. That's why Sophie Cunningham's transformation matters so much. She read the direction correctly. But there's a second development that makes Clark's return even more dangerous. She's reportedly leaner too. That detail shouldn't be overlooked. When Clark sheds bulk and refines her conditioning, she's signaling something very specific. The pace is about to intensify. Less weight means quicker lateral movement, faster deceleration, sharper cuts, greater endurance for extended stretches of chaos. Imagine last season's tempo. Now imagine it slightly faster. That's not just an offensive tweak. That's a system reset. And this is where roster construction becomes fragile. Because in a high-speed transition system, the margin for lineup inefficiency shrinks dramatically. One slow defender creates a chain reaction. One non-shooter compresses spacing. One isolation-heavy possession disrupts rhythm. Clark's gravity thrives on flow, continuous movement, immediate decisions. If the offense stalls into stagnant dribbling, the entire geometry collapses. Which brings us to the coaching variable. Stephanie White steps into a situation that looks promising on the surface. A rising superstar, a young core, national spotlight. But underneath that promise lies a strategic fork in the road. Does she fully embrace the Clark tempo? Or does she attempt to balance it with more traditional structure? That decision isn't minor. If the offense leans into veteran isolation tendencies, the pace slows. If it prioritizes established scoring hierarchies over spacing, transition frequency drops. If rotations favor comfort over speed, the identity blurs. And blurred identities don't win championships. There's also the locker room factor. When a system is built around one player's strengths, even if deserved, it creates silent pressure. Veterans who've built careers on a different rhythm have to adapt publicly, even if privately they prefer another style. No one will say it outright, but stylistic tension is real in professional sports. Clark's return doesn't just energize the fan base. It forces philosophical alignment. Are you building around pace, shooting, and space? Or are you hedging? Because hedging in a high-speed offense is dangerous. It creates hybrid lineups that don't fully commit to either identity. And partial commitment is where seasons unravel. Now picture this scenario. Clark returns sharper. Cunningham is lighter and faster. The crowd energy spikes. Transition possessions increase. Early games show glimpses of unstoppable flow. Then a rotation change slows things down. A veteran-heavy lineup struggles to run. Isolation possessions creep in. The spacing tightens. The rhythm fractures. Fans notice immediately. The pressure builds instantly. And suddenly, lineup decisions become headline material. That's not drama for the sake of drama. That's the reality of managing a generational talent whose skill set demands ecosystem precision. Clark's return magnifies everything. If the offense flows, it will look unstoppable. If it stutters, questions will surface fast. And that's where one player becomes absolutely critical. Not the loudest voice, not the highest scorer, but the one who fits the geometry perfectly. Lexi Hull. Because if Clark is the engine, and Cunningham rebuilt herself to run alongside it, Hull might be the piece that determines whether the machine hums or overheats. And the conversation around her role is getting louder for a reason. But what makes this situation explosive isn't just basketball strategy. It's the fact that starting her might not be as automatic as fans assume. And that's where the real tension begins. There's always one player in every high-powered system who doesn't dominate headlines, but quietly determines whether it works. For Indiana, that player might be Lexi Hull. And the conversation around her role isn't just about minutes. It's about identity. Because when you strip away emotion and look purely at basketball geometry, Hull represents something extremely specific and extremely valuable. She doesn't need the ball to be effective. She doesn't stop the flow. She defends relentlessly. She spaces correctly. She runs without hesitation. In a Clark-centered offense, those traits aren't complementary. They're essential. Clark bends defenses the second she crosses half court. Two defenders shade high. Help defenders hesitate. Weak side rotations overcommit. That creates invisible passing lanes that only exist for a split second. Those windows are wasted if the receiving player isn't already in motion. Hull doesn't wait. She anticipates. That's the difference. And in transition-heavy systems, anticipation beats talent more often than people realize. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. Coaches historically love control. They love structure. They love predictable scoring outlets. Veteran presence. Players who can slow things down and manufacture points late in the shot clock. Hull doesn't dominate isolation possessions. She thrives in motion. That can be undervalued by traditional coaching instincts. And that's exactly why the fan pressure around her starting role is so loud. Because supporters see the math clearly. When Hull shares the floor with Clark and a mobile wing like Cunningham, the spacing becomes suffocating. Defenses can't pack the paint. They can't overhelp without conceding open perimeter looks. They can't comfortably switch everything because Hull fights through screens and contests relentlessly. It's not flashy. It's surgical. And when she plays extended minutes, something subtle happens. The offense breathes. Possessions feel lighter. The ball moves faster. The lanes open wider. But here's the problem. Basketball decisions don't happen in a vacuum. Locker rooms are ecosystems too. Veterans have pride. Established players expect roles. Coaches inherit dynamics they didn't personally create. And when a new coach arrives, there's always a recalibration period. Stephanie White stepping into this environment adds another variable. Does she lean fully into Clark's pace and space blueprint? Or does she attempt to balance egos and experience? Because make no mistake, starting lineups send messages. If Hull starts consistently, it signals total commitment to speed, defense, and spacing. If she doesn't, it signals compromise. And compromise in a system built on tempo can be lethal. There's also a durability angle people overlook. Hull proved last season she can handle defensive assignments without fading. She absorbs tough matchups. She contests without fouling excessively. She stays engaged even when her shot attempts fluctuate. That reliability matters over a long season. Because when pace increases, fatigue compounds. Defensive lapses widen. Communication breaks down faster. Hull stabilizes chaos. And stability is rare in high-speed systems. But here's where the narrative gets even sharper. If Clark returns at peak conditioning, if Cunningham's leaner frame maximizes transition bursts, and if Hull remains glued to the bench for long stretches, the visual contrast will be impossible to ignore. Fast breaks that stall because spacing isn't optimal. Perimeter defense that softens when legs tire. Possessions that drift into isolation rather than flow. Fans won't stay quiet. And modern fan bases amplify quickly. That creates external pressure. Pressure influences rotations. Rotations influence chemistry. Chemistry influences momentum. And momentum decides seasons. Now zoom out for a second. This isn't about one starting spot. It's about whether Indiana commits fully to becoming the fastest, most disruptive offensive team in the league, or whether it hesitates. Because hesitation benefits opponents. If teams know they can force Indiana into slower sets by manipulating matchups, they'll do it every time. They'll bait switches. They'll sag off non-shooters. They'll clog the lane and dare someone else to create off the dribble. Hull eliminates that comfort. Her presence says, you don't get to relax. And that's why the public start her message isn't random noise. It's a tactical demand. But there's an even deeper layer to Hull's positioning that most people didn't see coming. While debates rage about rotations, while analysts argue about spacing, while fans speculate about locker room politics, Hull quietly made a move that changes her leverage entirely. Because securing your on-court role is one thing. Securing your financial independence in the Clark spotlight, that's something else entirely. And what she did off the court might be even more strategic than anything happening between the lines. Because while some players are fighting for percentage points in league revenue, Hull appears to be building something far more direct. And once you understand that play, you start to realize this isn't just about basketball anymore. It's about who truly understands the Clark era, and who's positioning themselves to win from it. But to see that clearly, we have to talk about the business move nobody expected. While fans argue over rotations, while analysts debate minutes, while social media explodes over who should start, Lexi Hull did something far more calculated. She stepped outside the salary structure entirely. Because here's the reality nobody likes to admit. Even in a rising league, role players don't become wealthy from contracts alone. Not at generational levels. Not quickly. Superstars get shoe deals, national commercials, major endorsement campaigns. Everyone else, they fight for supplemental income. But Hull recognized something before most players fully processed it. Caitlin Clark doesn't just generate attention. She bends the attention economy. Every game becomes a content event. Every tunnel walk trends. Every post-game comment spreads. Every teammate within camera frame receives amplified exposure. That's not hype. That's distribution power. And in the modern economy, distribution is everything. Launching a direct-to-consumer brand in normal conditions is risky. Customer acquisition costs are brutal. Advertising budgets disappear fast. Social media algorithms bury unknown brands. But what happens when you're attached to the most watched athlete in women's basketball? You don't pay for eyeballs. They arrive automatically. That's the halo effect. And Hull appears to understand it perfectly. Instead of waiting for a traditional endorsement deal, instead of relying on league negotiations, instead of hoping corporate sponsors eventually circle back, She positioned herself to monetize the spotlight directly. That's a mindset shift. And it tells you something critical about how she views this era. She's not resisting the Clark gravity. She's aligning with it. There's a huge difference. Some players around generational stars feel overshadowed. They subtly compete for touches. They worry about individual statistics. They guard their spotlight. Others lean in. They say, if this engine is running, I'm building my structure right beside it. Hull seems to fall into the second category. And that choice creates leverage. Because now her value isn't tied exclusively to points per game. It's tied to brand expansion, media presence, and market positioning. If she plays well alongside Clark, her exposure multiplies. If she defends elite scorers on nationally televised games, her credibility rises. If she hits clutch corner threes in high-speed transition moments, her visibility spikes. Every successful possession becomes marketing. That's the new ecosystem. And this is where the strategic brilliance becomes clearer. Clark's return doesn't just increase Indiana's championship odds. It increases economic velocity. Players close to the action benefit disproportionately. Hull isn't waiting for the league to adjust revenue splits. She's building parallel income streams in real time. That's survival at a different level. But here's the fascinating part. Off-court independence also changes on-court psychology. When a player doesn't feel financially cornered, when they aren't desperately chasing stats for contract leverage, they can embrace role precision. Hull doesn't need to overdribble. She doesn't need to hijack possessions. She can commit fully to defense, spacing, and efficiency because her long-term security isn't tied solely to box score dominance. That's dangerous for opponents. Because a player who understands their role and isn't chasing validation becomes incredibly steady. And steadiness fuels championship systems. Now zoom out again. Sophie Cunningham rebuilt her body to fit the Clark tempo. Hull built a business to capitalize on Clark's attention wave. Both decisions point in the same direction. Commitment. They're not hedging. They're not preparing for a slowdown contingency plan. They're preparing for acceleration. Which raises a bigger question. If key players are optimizing themselves physically and financially for a Clark-centered system, does that mean the internal belief in her return is absolute? Because athletes don't gamble transformations like this without confidence. And when you listen carefully to the tone in recent comments surrounding Clark's comeback, it doesn't sound cautious. It sounds expectant, like they've already seen what's coming. And that's where the so-called bombshell message starts to take shape. It wasn't a loud declaration. It wasn't controversial phrasing. It was something more subtle. Confidence without hesitation. Belief without qualifiers. And in professional sports, that kind of tone reveals alignment. Because if there were doubts, you'd hear softer language. You'd hear, we'll see. You'd hear, taking it one game at a time. Instead, the messaging feels different. Which leads to the final and perhaps most important layer of this entire situation. If the locker room is unified around Clark's acceleration, if the supporting cast has adapted, if the off-court leverage is secured, then the only remaining variable is whether the coaching philosophy matches that momentum. And that's where this entire story reaches its tipping point. Because the return of a generational player doesn't just raise expectations. It exposes every weak link in the chain. And what happens next could either cement this as the beginning of a new era, or reveal cracks nobody wants to admit exist. Now it's time to confront the real message hidden inside all of this. The bombshell wasn't a headline. It wasn't some explosive quote. It wasn't locker room drama or leaked tension. It was something far more powerful. Certainty. When Sophie Cunningham talked about preparing her body, when Lexi Hull discussed the direction of the team, when both of them addressed Caitlin Clark's return, there was no hesitation in their tone. No cautious optimism. No, if she's the same. No, we'll figure it out. It sounded like they already know what's coming. And that's what makes this moment so important. Because in professional sports, language reveals belief. If teammates sense uncertainty, they hedge publicly. If they're unsure about chemistry, they soften expectations. If they fear system instability, they stay vague. But what we're hearing doesn't feel vague. It feels aligned. Aligned around pace. Aligned around spacing. Aligned around maximizing Clark's gravity rather than resisting it. And that alignment matters more than any off-season headline. Because let's be honest about something. The Clark effect hasn't just brought attention. It's brought pressure. Every arena sells out. Every broadcast magnifies mistakes. Every lineup decision becomes social media debate. That type of spotlight fractures fragile locker rooms, unless the core is unified. And the moves we've seen, the body transformation, the business positioning, the public tone, suggest something very clear. The inner circle isn't fighting the spotlight. They're building around it. That's not accidental. That's strategic. Now imagine this scenario. Clark returns at full speed. The pace jumps immediately. Cunningham is lighter, quicker, moving instinctively in transition. Hull is spacing perfectly, locking down perimeter threats, knocking down open looks. The offense flows naturally. The crowd energy compounds. Momentum builds. That's not hype. That's structural alignment. And here's the uncomfortable truth for the rest of the league. If Indiana commits fully to that identity, they become extremely difficult to guard. Because you can't scheme against pure tempo without sacrificing something else. You can't trap Clark aggressively without leaving shooters open. You can't sag off shooters without giving Clark driving lanes. You can't slow the game down without executing flawlessly for 40 minutes. And very few teams can maintain that precision under relentless pace. But here's where things get even more layered. The bombshell message isn't just that they believe in Clark. It's that they're betting their careers on her style. Cunningham doesn't drop nearly 16 pounds unless she believes the pace will intensify. Hull doesn't align her brand with the spotlight unless she believes the spotlight will expand. Those are long-term bets, not short-term optimism. And when multiple players make that bet simultaneously, it signals internal conviction. Which raises the final question. Will the coaching philosophy match that conviction? Because if Stephanie White leans fully into this acceleration, if she starts the right combinations, if she commits to speed over comfort, Indiana could become the most disruptive offensive force in the league. But if hesitation creeps in, if rotations prioritize familiarity over fit, if the offense drifts into isolation stagnation, the alignment fractures. And once alignment fractures under a national spotlight, recovery becomes harder. That's the tension beneath the surface. Not drama, not scandal, direction. Because generational players don't just change stat sheets. They change ecosystems. They reshape careers. They elevate some. They expose others. And right now, Sophie Cunningham and Lexi Hull look like players who chose elevation. They adapted early. They positioned strategically. They embraced the pace. And they publicly reinforced confidence in what's coming. That's not random commentary. That's readiness. Here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Not everyone benefits from a generational superstar. Some players rise. Some players adapt. And some quietly get erased. That's the reality of every major shift in professional sports history. When Steph Curry changed the geometry of the NBA, certain post-heavy centers disappeared almost overnight. When pace and space took over, mid-range isolation specialists saw their minutes shrink. The game evolves. And evolution isn't polite. Caitlin Clark represents that kind of shift for the WNBA. Not just because of her scoring, not just because of her passing, but because of the tempo she demands. When Clark is healthy and fully unleashed, the court stretches to uncomfortable distances. Defensive schemes collapse faster. Shot clocks feel shorter. Transition opportunities double. And suddenly, players who were once perfectly serviceable in slower systems look out of place. That's not personal. It's structural. And you can already see the dividing line forming. On one side, players like Cunningham and Hull, who reshape themselves physically and strategically to align with the speed. On the other side, players who still thrive in deliberate half-court rhythm. There's nothing wrong with that style. But it doesn't pair seamlessly with Clark's instincts. And that's where careers start to feel pressure. Because when a system becomes centered around quick decisions and deep-range gravity, hesitation becomes visible. Heavy legs become noticeable. Isolation possessions feel disruptive instead of stabilizing. Fans feel it instantly. The camera catches it instantly. The analytics expose it instantly. And under a national spotlight, those exposures multiply. Now add another uncomfortable layer. Clark doesn't just influence teammates. She influences front office decisions. When an organization realizes it has a generational engine, roster construction shifts accordingly. Draft priorities change. Free agent profiles change. Development pipelines change. You stop building for balance. You start building for optimization. That means younger, faster wings become more attractive. Conditioning standards tighten. Shooting becomes non-negotiable. Defensive versatility becomes mandatory. And suddenly, the margin for traditional role security shrinks. This isn't hypothetical. You can already see younger players across the league preparing differently. Training regimens emphasize endurance. Three-point volume increases. Transition drills intensify. Because everyone understands something quietly. The league's most watched player sets the rhythm. And if you can't match that rhythm, your minutes decline. Now here's where the real tension builds. Veteran pride doesn't disappear easily. Established players who built careers on toughness and isolation, scoring won't simply accept reduced roles without internal resistance. Even if that resistance is silent. And silent resistance is dangerous in fast systems. Because fast systems require full buy-in. Half commitment slows everything down. One missed sprint in transition breaks a fast break. One late rotation in space opens a corner three. One hesitation pass kills momentum. You don't notice it immediately. But over time, it compounds. Which is why alignment around Clark's return matters so much. Cunningham aligned physically. Hull aligned strategically and financially. But the entire roster has to align mentally. Because if even a few players are subconsciously resisting the pace, the system won't fully ignite. And here's what makes this even more dramatic. The spotlight doesn't allow slow adjustments. When you're playing in front of sold-out arenas and national broadcasts, development timelines compress. Mistakes trend. Lineup inefficiencies get debated instantly. That accelerates pressure. And pressure reveals fractures. Now imagine early season struggles. A couple tough losses. Fans question rotations. Analysts debate whether the offense looks disjointed. Social media amplifies every miscommunication. Under that heat, players who didn't fully adapt feel it the most. And that's when coaching decisions become ruthless. Because when championship windows appear, patience shortens. Clark's presence doesn't just create opportunity. It creates urgency. And urgency reshapes job security. For players. For coaches. Even for front office executives. That's why this moment feels bigger than just an injury return. It feels like a pivot point. Because if the Fever fully unlock a high-speed, fully committed Clark-centered system, the league shifts. Opponents scramble to keep up. Roster archetypes evolve. And players who can't sprint, shoot, and defend in space consistently, they get phased out. Not loudly, not dramatically, but gradually. And once that process starts, it doesn't reverse. Now think about what that means long-term. If Cunningham's lighter frame becomes the new standard, if Hull's 3 and D precision becomes the model, if business-savvy players begin leveraging the halo effect instead of resisting it, the blueprint spreads. Young prospects entering the league train specifically for that environment. College players model their games accordingly. The ripple effect extends far beyond Indiana. That's how eras begin. Not with one viral moment, but with a structural shift that forces adaptation across the board. And we may be standing right at that edge. Because Clark's return isn't just about whether she drops 30 points. It's about whether the ecosystem around her locks into place. If it does, we're watching the early stages of a dominance cycle. If it doesn't, we'll see flashes of brilliance mixed with frustrating stagnation. But the players who've already adapted won't regret their decisions. Because even if short-term turbulence appears, the direction of the league feels clear. Faster, wider, more perimeter-driven, more conditioning-focused, more brand-conscious. And that's why Section 6 matters. Because while everyone debates starting lineups and injury timelines, the real story is survival. Who recognizes the shift early, who commits fully, who builds around it, and who quietly gets left behind. The Clark era isn't waiting for consensus. It's already moving. And the players who sense that first, they might be the ones still standing when the dust settles. So here's what this really comes down to. Caitlin Clark's return isn't a reset. It's a stress test. A stress test for conditioning, for lineup decisions, for locker room unity, for coaching philosophy, for business awareness. Sophie Cunningham responded by rebuilding her body. Lexi Hull responded by strengthening both her on-court fit and her off-court leverage. Both moves tell the same story. They're not waiting to see what happens. They're preparing for acceleration. Now the only remaining question is whether the entire organization moves at that same speed. Because in the Clark era, hesitation gets exposed instantly. And full commitment? That becomes terrifying for opponents. So what do you think? Is Cunningham's transformation the exact adjustment required to thrive in this system? Is Hull the non-negotiable starter that unlocks the offense? Will Stephanie White go all in on pace, or try to balance identities? And most importantly, are we about to witness the full ignition of the Clark era? Drop your raw, unfiltered take in the comments below. And if you want breakdowns that go beyond box scores, beyond headlines, beyond mainstream narratives, make sure you hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay locked in. Because this season isn't just about basketball. It's about evolution. And we're going to be exposing every shift as it happens. I'll see you in the next one.